The Mercedes-Benz GLB is one of the best small crossovers available in America, and if you're looking for a small luxury crossover with a lot of practicality and a lot of room, you should definitely put the GLB on your shopping list. Today I'm taking a look at a really intriguing version. This is the GLB 35, so this is the performance version of the GLB at the moment in the US. There is a rumored GLB 45 coming at some point later. But this is also something different. This is the smallest three-row crossover available in the United States. Yes, you can get a third row in the GLB, even though this is theoretically somewhere between a compact and a subcompact crossover. The GLB is very closely related to the other entry-level Mercedes in America, the GLA crossover, which is smaller than the GLB, also the A-Class sedan, and the CLA Class four-door coupe. All four of these vehicles start under $40,000. They share engines and a lot of interior styling components. But I think that the GLB is the most attractive member of this quartet. This model was definitely styled after the very large GLS, the headlining crossover in their lineup. At 182.4 inches long, the GLB is probably best described as a compact crossover because this is 9 inches longer than the Mercedes-Benz GLA. But making this a little confusing, Mercedes also has the GLC, which is their traditional compact crossover offering in the US. It's rear-wheel drive rather than front-wheel drive and only 1 inch longer than this, but it does not have a third row option. As far as size comparisons go, the next closest three-row vehicle available in the US right now is the Volkswagen Tiguan. It's about 3 inches longer than this. The Lexus RXL is 14 inches longer than this. I'm including the RXL because it's about the same price as the GLB right here, but it has 12 inches less legroom somehow. The rear-end design of the GLB is perhaps a little bit more controversial than the other angles. This is certainly styled different than the GLA, which honestly looks like a hot hatch, I guess you'd say. This looks a little bit more minivan-like because of the third row and the desire to have headroom in the back and cargo room behind the third row. Since this is the AMG performance version of the GLB, we have some aero treatments going on the bottom of the bumper and dual exhausts. Until Mercedes confirms that AMG 45 variant of the GLB, there are two engines under the hood. The base model gets a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo engine producing 221 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. It's mated to the newer 8-speed dual-clutch transmission, not the older 7-speed DCT that we still find in some of Mercedes front-wheel drive models. You have your choice of front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive with that engine. Then we have the AMG 35 version, which uses a really heavily reworked version of that same 2-liter engine. It produces 302 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. If you want to go absolutely insane, theoretically the 45 version would bring this same basic engine design with a lot of reworked internals yet again up to about 400 horsepower, but no details are official just yet. One of the interesting things about the GLB is the fact that we can still get that third row in the AMG variant, in the front-wheel drive model, or the all-wheel drive model. So it doesn't matter how you want to get your GLB, you can still get the third row. Front seat comfort in this vehicle is a bit of a mixed bag if I'm honest, mainly because of the price tag. This GLB is about $60,000 as equipped, and it doesn't have some features that you might want like radar adaptive cruise control. Bearing in mind that there are a ton of luxury compact crossovers like the GLC, the BMW X3, etc. that are within the price range of this particular GLB, then I'm going to give these front seats 6 out of 10 points. Mainly because the cushioning is a little bit firm for my tastes, it's not quite as adjustable as I would like, and it lacks some of the luxury features that you might find in those more expensive models. This model does not have ventilated seats, doesn't have seat massage at this price point, and you will find seat massage at a similar price point in some of the competition. Bearing in mind, of course, that those competitors won't have 3 rows. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, a memory seat for the driver and front passenger with 3-position memory settings there, and a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. The next step is obviously to move the second row seats forwards. That way I can give the third row a little bit of extra room. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. I'm leaving myself 2 inches of legroom between my knees and this front seat back. That's not too much of a problem in the GLB because headroom is very generous. I have several inches of headroom because this model does have the dual pane moonroof and there's a reasonable amount of room there. Now let's talk about the third row. If you've ever been to Europe and rented a car and selected a 3-row vehicle because you had perhaps 6 people with you traveling, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that this is a very European third row in the GLB. Bear in mind that the GLB is a relatively small vehicle still. This is 1 inch shorter than the GLC or the BMW X3 or a Volvo XC60, so this is not as big as something like a Toyota Highlander by any stretch. And that means that the doors are going to be notably smaller. Since this is related to the rest of the Mercedes subcompact vehicle family, you'll notice that these front seats are actually positioned a little bit behind the B-pillar in the vehicle. A taller person up front, for instance, with their head back here on the headrest in a comfortable position, would actually have their elbow bopping right there on that pillar, and their head is going to be right there by that post. I want to be rational and safe, so I'm leaving myself several inches between my knees and the dashboard, and my legs are right there flat against the seat bottom cushion. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, then you know that I love teeny tiny emergency third rows because they're just so practical. Having a third row option, as long as it doesn't take up too much cargo space, is something that I would definitely select in any new vehicle that I was shopping for, because you never know when you might need to be able to carry 6 people. With that front seat adjuster for me at 6 feet tall, the second row adjuster for me at 6 feet tall, I can actually sit back here relatively comfortably. I have about 1.5 inches of legroom left right there. Now my head is touching the ceiling. I have to crane my head to one side, but honestly, this is considerably more comfortable than the Lexus RX 3-row. The seat bottom cushion is pretty darn close to the ground, not as close to the ground as I had expected, so adults are not going to find this horribly comfortable for hours and hours at a time, but it's certainly something that you could do for a 30-minute trip to lunch. Another really practical touch in here is that Mercedes does not delete the 40-20-40 folding second row seat back when you get the third row seats. So we still have the ability to fold down that center section. And that means that if you did have some taller people that you needed to be able to put in here, they'd always be able to put their knee right here in the middle and have that center seat folded. There's that center 20% section of the second row folded down. You can see that there is still enough room for child seats or adults on either side of that. Really practical cargo carrying touch there. This is the dual pane moonroof. You can see that that second pane is right back there by the second row person's heads. All the way back in the third row, we have some pretty eccentric headrests for the third row passengers. A lot of hard plastics as you'd expect back here, but we do have some really tiny storage cubbies there and a place where you could dock a roller cover for your cargo area. Is the third row small? Absolutely. Would I want to do that for hours and hours at a time? Probably not, but I have spent thousands of miles driving across Europe in a Peugeot with 3 rows that was actually a little bit smaller than this. Admittedly, I was not the person jammed into the third row. It was a good friend of mine, but hey, he's lived to tell the tale. So again, I love the option of a third row in a small vehicle like this. Now, the one downside obviously is cargo room behind the third row. We find just over 5 cubic feet of cargo space back here. So really all you could stick back here is maybe a handbag or a pencil stroller or something like that. You're really not going to fit any luggage back here. But if we fold the third row seats, then you'll find between 20 and 27 cubic feet of storage space depending on the position of the second row, because the second row slides forward and backward and it tilts, so you can maximize your cargo space back here if you need to. Obviously, the 3-row model is going to have a little bit less cargo room than the 2-row model, but we do have a teeny tiny bit of extra storage back here in the 3-row model. Moving inside, the GLB 35 is, as you'd expect, basically the same as the rest of the GLB lineup. So we have that dual pane moonroof I mentioned earlier, again that smaller pane right back there over the rear passengers' heads, height adjustable shoulder belts, and 4-way adjustable headrests. The bolstering isn't terribly aggressive on the seat bottom cushion. It's a little bit more aggressive on the seat back cushion, but remember that these seats are pretty narrow. So if you're a little bit of a larger person, you might find these seats just a little bit too small. You can see that manually extending thigh cushion down there on the bottom of that seat. You can definitely tell the doors are small because this is a small vehicle. You can see that seat position right there. This is still moved forward for me getting back there into the third row. We have a ton of different trim options as you'd expect in any modern Mercedes. This has a really interesting open pore wood trim. It's a little bit difficult to tell on camera, but in addition to being striped, the wood also has a 3D relief there, so it sort of feels like reclaimed barn wood. We have a ambient lighting strip running right there through that section, and then same thing over here on the dashboard with some metallic accents going on. Very similar air vents to what we find in larger and more expensive Mercedes models. We have a dual LCD setup on the dashboard where we have one screen for the instrument cluster and a separate screen for the infotainment system. Very similar to what we see in very large and expensive Mercedes, but they do scale the screens to the size of the interior. So these screens, although we get the same setup as we find in the GLS, these are actually a little bit smaller. As you'd expect, we get smartphone integration, but it does not occupy the entire screen. You can see the screen is a little bit wider than Apple CarPlay right there. Below that, we have an engine start-stop button with the disable button for the start-stop system for the car. Large air vents there, dual zone automatic climate control. We have a storage cubby where you can keep your smartphone. This does not have a lid on it. We have a single USB input for the system, 12-volt power port right there. 2 pretty large cup holders. These are some of the best cup holders that we find in German cars today. They still don't seem to completely understand America's love for cup holders. Over here we have the drive mode selector. This allows us to choose between a wide variety of different drive modes, including an individual drive mode where you can customize a bunch of things with the AMG setup. Mercedes lets you adjust a few more things in their custom drive mode than we see other manufacturers. Drive relates primarily to the engine and transmission, but it also makes the exhaust sound a little bit different, so dynamic is obviously the most fun there. Transmission, drive is probably what you're going to want. Dynamics, this adjusts the way the stability and traction control system in the vehicle behaves. I prefer basic because it'll help catch you before you do anything stupid. If you wanted more aggressive stability control tuning, you could always select one of those other built-in drive modes. We then have suspension settings, Comfort, Sport, and Sport Plus. Back to the center console, we have a touchpad controller for that infotainment system. It supports touchscreen operation, the touch controller here, and a touchpad on the steering wheel as well. Power and volume button over there and some direct access buttons around it. We have a very small wrist rest here. Because this is the AMG model, we have a button for the manual transmission mode, that stability and traction control, enable disable button right there, and then a button for the suspension. Between the front seats, we find a bifold style armrest that opens to reveal a storage cubby where I was not able to squeeze a half gallon of milk inside. There is an additional USB port in there, however, and from this angle you can see the air vents for the rear seat passengers. Bear in mind that even in this 3-row vehicle, there are no air vents in the way back. The LCD instrument cluster is one of the more configurable available in this segment, but you'll never get satellite map imagery like you do find in some modern Audis. In addition to being able to adjust the design, you can use this controller on the left side of the steering wheel to choose the content inside each of these 3 sections of the display. So for instance, if I wanted to see my drive mode settings there or a G gauge, you can also get a moving map display on some of these areas. You can get safety displays, turn-by-turn navigation directions, status of the vehicles, infotainment systems, etc. And if you prefer a more simple design, you can also choose for one of those options to take over full screen. This AMG steering wheel is one of my favorite designs. It has kind of flattish sections on the side and then a flat bottom as you'd expect in a sport wheel. We have some perforated leather on the sides, sport grips up top, and then paddle shifters on the back. The paddles are nice and large and the spokes are fairly thin, so it's pretty easy to see the paddle. This is not Mercedes' latest steering wheel design, and I'm actually okay with that because I found this design to be a little bit easier to use. Mercedes is slowly moving their steering wheels over to different control designs. There are more touch buttons, and then this touch-sensitive controller for the infotainment system or that instrument cluster is changing as well. In this model, we have a physical dial for the volume. You click it in to mute. We have some dedicated phone buttons, voice command button, favorite button there, and then these 3 options here relate to that infotainment system in the dash. This is sort of like the controller that you used to find in a 1990s BlackBerry. We have nearly identical controls on the left side of the steering wheel. These top 3 controls relate to that instrument cluster. The bottom controls are for the cruise control system. This one does not have adaptive cruise control. As we see in other AMG models, there's some additional buttons on the steering wheel. There's a little LCD in here, so you can click the icon and change what this button does. These 2 controls roll through basically the same options, but you can't obviously choose the same option on both of them. They just run through the same subset, and then you enable and disable the option with the button on this side. This one over here is the drive mode selector. You just roll through your drive mode options or click down for individual. As with the other entry-level Mercedes vehicles in the US, this has a dual-clutch transmission. But this is the newer Mercedes 8-speed DCT design, and it is certainly going to be smoother when coming off the line than the 7-speed that this replaces, especially the early software tunes of that 7-speed DCT. But the reason we have a DCT here is twofold: performance and fuel economy, both of which are very good in this GLB 35. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 5 seconds flat. That's just a hair faster than Mercedes quoted, making this one of the fastest vehicles in this segment. Actually, whether you're even talking about the compact segment or the subcompact segment, the GLB 35 is pretty swift. You will find faster 0 to 60 times in something like a GLC 43 or the GLC 63, obviously, but they're going to be much more than this. The tricky bit, of course, is that there is so much pricing overlap within the Mercedes family. We'll talk about that later in this video, but you could get some discount versions of performance vehicles in the next category up that would be similar or faster than this for about the same price. On the other hand, this is notably quicker than the base engines we find in the rest of the European competition. The Q3, the XC40, the BMW X1, etc. It also stops really quickly from 60 miles an hour back to 0, just 109 feet. That is an excellent stopping distance, and honestly, I was a little bit surprised by that, but it's likely all down to the brakes and the tires on this model. We have pretty wide tires for a vehicle in this category, and we also have very aggressive performance brakes. So even though this is one of the discount AMG models, they weren't skimping when it comes to bumping up the performance level pretty much everywhere in the GLB. You will certainly notice that in the handling. This is one of the best handling front-wheel drive vehicles made in the world today. Just like the CLA and the A-Class and the GLA are some of the best handling front-wheel drive vehicles as well. This reminds me an awful lot in a way of the Volkswagen Golf R, or I guess you could say the Golf R also reminds me of this. Both vehicles have very similar tuning and very similar feel. One thing that has surprised me about Mercedes transverse platforms is that they don't give us any sort of torque vectoring in the back. So even though this has a great solid feel to it out on the road, this feels sort of like a grown-up hot hatch, I guess you could say. It's not gonna torque vector in the corners like you'll find in an Acura super handling all-wheel drive system. Admittedly not in a vehicle in this quite size category, but you could get an RDX for this price. Or obviously a Mercedes-Benz GLC, which is a really good competitor to this. The GLC is going to be a little bit less expensive starting than the model that I'm driving right here, and it's going to start as a rear-wheel drive crossover. And the base 4-cylinder engine in that model is a really, really great base engine. Now, it's not going to be quite as quick 0 to 60, but it is going to be shockingly close, and it's going to be smoother because it's a traditional automatic transmission. One complaint about dual clutch transmissions like this is that they can be a little bit herky-jerky in stop and go or slow and go traffic. Mercedes has certainly smoothed that a lot with the 8-speed, but it is still there. You'll also notice that on hills this will roll forward or roll backward just like a manual transmission vehicle would. It does have brake hold, but after that brake hold expires, it's going to roll just like a manual transmission car, because it is a manual transmission car. It's just that the robot is doing the shifting for you. As long as we're comparing the GLB to subcompact vehicles like the XC40, the X1, etc., I'm certainly going to give handling an A in this model. I don't think it's quite as engaging as the lower to the ground models in Mercedes lineup, so it's not quite as engaging as the GLA or the CLA or the A-Class, but it is still excellent. Obviously, the ride in the 35 is going to be firmer than the base version of the GLB, but I think that this is a little bit better balanced than the base AMG versions of the A-Class or the CLA or, of course, the GLA. I haven't spent too much time in the GLA. Hopefully there will be a full review coming up of that very soon. Even in the comfort mode, you are certainly going to feel more of the small imperfections coming through into the cabin, but I have to say I think that the ride quality in comfort mode, remember that this does have an adaptive suspension system, is substantially similar to the Volvo XC40, which is also a top pick of mine in this segment. Now, the XC40 is a little bit smaller than this, so I wouldn't exactly call it a direct competitor. But obviously the regular GLB is going to be more supple than this, and obviously the ride quality in the BMW X1, the regular X1, is also better than this, so I'm going to give this a B- when it comes to ride quality. On the other hand, if you want to compare this to similarly priced compact crossovers, then I would have to drop that score a little bit, because you are going to find more engaging options like the Alfa Romeo Stelvio, like the Mercedes-Benz GLC, the BMW X3. They're all going to be in a similar price category to this particular model. And you will notice that most of those will be quieter. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 73.5 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. There's not quite as much sound deadening, not quite as much isolation between this vehicle's cabin and the road as we find in that next level up. So certainly the cabin is going to be a noisier place to spend your time. You will really notice that out on broken pavement, out on the highway if the highway is paved with old asphalt, etc. This cabin is going to be a lot louder than a GLC or an X3 or an XC60. And even if you compare this within the subcompact category, vehicles like the BMW X2 or the Volvo XC40 or the Audi Q3, they're going to be quieter than this. As we see in the rest of Mercedes' small vehicle lineup, fuel economy is excellent. This vehicle is rated for 23 miles per gallon EPA, which doesn't sound terribly exciting, but I've been beating that by 3 mpg. We're getting just over 26 mpg over a week of mixed driving. That makes a lot of sense because the 8-speed DCT and the engine are closely related to what we see in that base GLB. Bottom lining the GLB 35 is pretty easy. This is just a great little crossover. If you're looking for something that's a little bit bigger than an X1 or an X2 or an XC40 or a Q3, but you don't need something that is quite as large as a GLE with a third row, you could get a GLB. And oddly enough, the third row in the back is not that much smaller than that next category up. We have shockingly similar rear legroom way back there in the third row to the BMW X5 or the Mercedes-Benz GLE. The main reason for that is that this was designed for small front-wheel drive engines to be sitting in there in the engine compartment, a front 2-liter 4-cylinder sitting transversely, not big inline 6 engines that are hanging out way in front of the cabin. So a lot of the size difference in terms of length is eaten up by bumpers and the big hood and big engine compartment that we find in those larger vehicles. Now, they're obviously going to be wider, but that does lend to the fun factor of this GLB 35 because this feels small, it feels nimble, it feels like it was really designed for these narrower roads that I'm always driving on. And I think Mercedes has done a pretty decent job with the exhaust note. This has a really nice sound to it, and now it's obviously a 4-cylinder engine sound. It's not going to be quite as exciting as those 6-cylinder AMG models. There was a little bit of digital augmentation going on there as well, but it is still a really nice sounding engine. The more I've thought about the GLB, the more I've come to think that it's sort of a modern luxury Kia Soul, if you will, because its very boxy proportions mean that it is much more practical than a lot of its direct competition in the US. And I think that's why Mercedes has been incredibly successful with the 1-2 punch of the GLA and the GLB in the United States. Mercedes leads this particular segment in terms of volume. Those two models together outsell pretty much everybody else by almost 2 to 1. In fact, each of these models individually outsells the BMW X1 by an enormous margin. If you want something that looks like a luxury hot hatch, that would be the Mercedes-Benz GLA. You can definitely get the hot versions in that. And if you want something that's a little bit boxier, more practical, and has one of the smallest third rows available in America, that would be the Mercedes-Benz GLB. Interestingly enough, this is not just the smallest 3-row vehicle available in the United States, it is the least expensive Mercedes 3-row by an enormous margin, nearly $20,000. If you want the GLB 250, that's going to set you back $38,050. All-wheel drive is an extra $2,000. If you want the high-performance one that I was driving, that's $49,500. Rumor mill also says to expect a GLB 45 at some point soon. That's probably going to be an additional $10,000 to $15,000 more. Now, the third row seat is not limited to specific trims. You can just toss it onto the base model for $850, or you can add it to a fully optioned GLB 35. There is no problem adding that onto the model, regardless of the other options that you choose. That's pretty handy because not every vehicle with an available third row will allow you to combine it with other options in the lineup. If you want that third row in a base GLB 250, that'll set you back $38,900. A GLE with the optional third row is $18,000 more expensive, and the GLA's third row option costs $2,100. Now, I'm not saying the GLB's third row is the best third row ever, because clearly things are pretty tight back there, but it has an emergency third row, and it is theoretically possible to put 6 adults in the GLB and have them all survive a 30-minute trip to lunch. If you're shopping for a GLB, I would certainly check the option box for that third row. I think it is worth every penny. If you really don't need a third row, you will get a little bit more cargo room if you don't choose that option. And the cargo room is another reason to get the GLB over the competition. Obviously, the GLB is a little bit larger on the outside. It is almost GLC sized, but we do have a very boxy and practical cargo area. We also have quite a lot of legroom, nearly Acura RDX levels of legroom, which is one of the leaders in the next segment up, the compact luxury segment. So another reason that you might want to get the GLB. Now let's dive into the competition. For 2020, this segment has seen a bit of a shakeup. The top 4 sellers in 2020 in the United States have been the Audi Q3, the Mercedes-Benz GLA, the GLB, and the Volvo XC40. Interestingly enough, on that top sales chart, the BMW X1 and X2 are pretty far down the list. So let's talk about the Audi Q3 first. It received a complete redesign relatively recently. Unfortunately, I have not been able to spend very much time in it thanks to the pandemic, but hopefully I will be able to just as soon as possible. I have to say the Q3 looks really good. I love the look inside and outside. I love some of the optional interior colors, especially the orange trim bits that we can find in there. It really makes it a little bit more unusual and a little bit more perhaps daring than some of the interior choices inside the Mercedes. It's also going to be less expensive. The GLB may start at $38,500, but they can get pretty pricey. The model that I was driving this week was considerably more expensive than that base model, and it wasn't a fully equipped GLB 35. So keep in mind that as you start adding options onto the Audi and the Mercedes is going to be consistently more expensive than the Audi. Now, is it worth it? That would depend on exactly what you're looking for. If you're after rear seat room and cargo room, then absolutely the GLB is the winner here. I also think that the GLB comes across as a more stately, more reserved, more traditional luxury designed interior. It certainly looks like a scale version of the rest of the Mercedes lineup, and I really think the outside is very attractive. Personally, I prefer the look of the GLB over the GLA. I think the GLA is just a little bit too boy racer hot hatch for me, but the GLB and its mini GLS style really work for me. Let me know what you think about that in the comment section. Next up, we have the Volvo XC40. I think it's pretty easy to see why the XC40 has become such a good seller in this segment, and why Volvo is following up with electric versions and a coupified electric version as well. The XC40's boxy styling clearly makes it very practical, but it's not as big as the boxy GLB. So if you're looking for more cargo room, more interior volume, and a vehicle that feels a little bit larger, that would certainly be the GLB. If you're looking for something that's decidedly less expensive, that would be the Volvo XC40. As far as handling goes, if we're talking about the regular GLB, then I would take the Volvo XC40. It has a really good driving dynamic, and things are an awful lot more equal in this segment now that we no longer have a rear-wheel drive BMW competitor. All the entries in this subcompact luxury segment are all front-wheel drive, and dynamically they're all relatively similar. But I think that the Volvo has a slight edge when it comes to actual on-the-road dynamics. It also has a traditional automatic transmission, so if you're not really a fan of dual-clutch transmissions, definitely keep that in mind. All versions of the GLB have a dual clutch transmission, and that means that they're not going to be as smooth in stop and go and slow and go traffic. One thing to know about the XC40 is that at the time that I am recording this video, the electric version of the XC40 and the new coupified version, the C40, both have the newer Google Android operating system in the dashboard, whereas the gasoline version does not. The gasoline version has the older system. So if you want the newer one, you should look at the EVs. If you want the older one, get one of the gasoline models for 2021. It's likely that in 2022, they will all switch over to the newer infotainment operating system with a slightly larger display in the dashboard. But details are still a little bit sketchy, so be sure and stay tuned. Next up, let's talk about the GLB versus something that is theoretically a little bit more appropriately sized, at least on the inside, and similarly priced, like the Acura RDX. There's definitely a lot of pricing overlap with these vehicles. The Mercedes starts at $38,050, the RDX at $38,040. The Acura tops out at around $52,000, and you can certainly get a GLB 250 up to very similar prices if you get carried away with the options. Now, the RDX is going to feel like a bigger vehicle. It is, in fact, a slightly bigger vehicle, but the difference is not enormous because the GLB has really been stretched quite a bit versus the GLA. The biggest difference between these two vehicles is going to be inside the cabin in terms of width. The rear seat is going to be wider in the RDX, but oddly enough, we don't find more combined legroom in the RDX, just half an inch more than we find in the GLB, thanks to the really boxy proportions. Where the RDX really excels is cargo area. It has about 50% more cargo room than we find in the GLB. That's quite logical because it is bigger, it's wider, and even though it's not quite as square as the GLB, the extra 4 inches in length mainly go to the cargo area in the back. It also has a 2-liter turbocharged engine sitting across the front engine bay. It's available as a front-wheel drive vehicle or an all-wheel drive vehicle with a 10-speed automatic transmission and Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. Now, all things being equal, if we had relatively similar tires on the vehicles, then the Mercedes does feel a little bit more nimble, a little bit more spry. It certainly has a different driving dynamic than the Acura, but if you add all-wheel drive, then the Acura does a really good job competing because the Acura can send more power to the rear axle and it can torque vector across the rear axle, something that we don't see in the GLB. Now, that doesn't turn the RDX into a rear-wheel drive Mercedes-Benz GLC, but it does mean that the RDX is a surprising amount of fun, and it also has that more traditional transmission feel. On the downside, the RDX's infotainment system is going to drive a lot of people to distraction. It is not my favorite input method. I definitely prefer the touchscreen setup that we have in the Mercedes. And I love the fact that Mercedes, even though they love their little touchpad and they love the steering wheel controls, they still give us a touchscreen as well. So you have those 3 different input methods to choose from, and Acura has decided to just give you one, their little touchpad in the center, and that is probably my least favorite input method. At the moment, bottom lining, the GLB is honestly pretty easy for me. This is one of my favorite Mercedes models. I love the fact that it's not terribly expensive. Admittedly, it does get expensive if you get carried away, but it is possible to find a GLB for around $40,000 to $45,000, and it's possible to get it with that third row in any of those forms. If you want a bit more oomph, there's that GLB 35, which is not exactly cheap at $49,500, but it's not as expensive as some of the other AMG Mercedes that are available in the United States. Personally, I would probably just stick with the GLB 250. The boxy design of the GLB is very practical whether or not you choose that optional third row, and I think that's really why it has taken over a lot of sales from the BMW X1, because the X1 was that practical alternative in this segment with a big cargo area and a generously sized back seat for a small crossover. But then along came the GLB, and it's just better at all of those things than the BMW X1 is at the moment. Let me know what you think about that down there. Be sure and head over to the merch store at aoamerch.com. Find me over at facebook.com/alexnautos so you can see what I'm driving this week, and I'll see all of you later.